There's a moment every sports fan recognizes. That split second where something happens on the court so obviously wrong, so blatantly ignored, that you find yourself yelling at your screen, wondering if the officials are even watching the same game. For Caitlin Clark fans, that moment didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It happened so consistently, so repeatedly, and so flagrantly that it stopped feeling like bad officiating and started feeling like something else entirely. Something deliberate, something calculated, something that the people running the WNBA either couldn't see or simply didn't want to. And then the injury happened, and suddenly, within days, 3 referees were suspended. Funny how that works. Because here's the thing nobody in the mainstream sports media wants to say out loud. The WNBA didn't suspend those referees because they finally grew a conscience. They didn't act because they watched the footage and felt bad about what was happening to their brightest star. They acted because the money started disappearing. The ratings started cratering, the ticket prices started collapsing, and the executives sitting in their comfortable offices suddenly realized that the product they had allowed to be physically dismantled on hardwood floors across the country was the same product keeping their entire league financially afloat. This isn't a story about 3 bad referees. This is a story about a league that failed its most important player in the most public, most documented, most embarrassing way possible, and then tried to quietly bury the fallout in a Tuesday morning press release. So let's go through all of it. Every missed call, every damning statistic, every behind-the-scenes revelation about who's actually controlling what happens on that court. And most importantly, let's talk about whether any of this actually changes when Caitlin Clark comes back. Because the answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about where the WNBA is really headed. If you want to understand exactly when the pressure finally became too great for the WNBA to ignore, you need to go back to the Indiana Fever versus the Valkyries game. Because that game didn't just expose bad officiating, it exposed a pattern so egregious, so statistically undeniable, that even the most casual fan watching from their couch could see something was deeply wrong. Start with the number that Coach Stephanie White brought up in the post-game press conference, -31. That's the free throw disparity the Indiana Fever had accumulated over their recent games. Think about what that number actually means for a second. 31 fewer trips to the free throw line than their opponents. In basketball, free throws are one of the most direct reflections of how physical the game is being played and how consistently the referees are calling what they see. A disparity of 5 or 6 over the course of a game raises eyebrows. A disparity of 10 becomes a storyline. -31 over recent contests isn't a storyline anymore. That's a systemic failure wearing a striped shirt and pretending not to notice. But numbers on a spreadsheet don't hit the same way as what happened in the closing seconds of that game. 2.9 seconds left on the clock. Indiana Fever down by 2. Caitlin Clark gets the ball. At that moment, with the right call from the officials, this game goes to overtime. The crowd goes insane. The highlight reel writes itself. Instead, what viewers watched unfold was one of the most blatant non-calls in recent WNBA memory. Kia Stokes makes contact with Clark, contact that's visible from the broadcast angle, visible from the replay angle, from every single angle available. The refs? Nothing. Complete radio silence. Not even a conversation between officials. Not even a moment of hesitation. Just a blank expression and a decision to let the game end the way it ended. The replays are genuinely damning. The physical contact shown on the playback is the kind of stuff that would draw a flag in almost any other context. Grabbing, shoving, applying pressure in ways that have nothing to do with contesting a basketball play and everything to do with disrupting the player making it. An NFL cornerback would recognize those techniques and probably appreciate the boldness. On a basketball court, in the final 3 seconds of a game, it should have been called immediately. It wasn't. And Caitlin Clark's reaction told you everything you needed to know about how fed up she was. She didn't slowly shake her head. She didn't walk away and let her teammates handle it. She turned directly to the officials and let them hear exactly what she thought about that decision, loudly, clearly, and with the kind of frustration that only builds up after months of swallowing the same injustice over and over again. Her teammates rushed to the referees too. Everyone on the Indiana Fever sideline understood what had just happened. The ref stood there and absorbed it all, and then did absolutely nothing about it.
Here's what makes that sequence of events even harder to digest.
That final non-call on Clark wasn't even the most egregious officiating failure of those closing possessions. There were 3 separate critical mistakes in the final sequence alone. Clark was hard fouled after completing a layup, no call. A defender made forceful physical contact that directly caused her to miss a shot, no call. And then, almost impossibly, Lexi Hall received a whistle for a phantom foul on Kia Stokes while Hall was in a perfectly legal defensive position. Clean defense, textbook positioning, whistle anyway. Meanwhile, Clark is being grabbed, shoved, and redirected on the other end, and the officials are apparently watching a completely different game. Ionescu stepped to the line, made the free throws, the game ended, and the conversation that had been quietly building for months finally exploded into the open. But what came next wasn't just a frustrated fan base going viral on social media. What came next was a head coach who had clearly decided she was done playing by the unspoken rules that keep most coaches from saying what they actually think. Stephanie White walked into that post-game press conference and did something that coaches in professional sports almost never do. She said exactly what she meant, named the exact numbers that proved her point, and made it clear that she was fully aware of the potential consequences and had decided she didn't care. She went straight to the -31 free throw disparity. She didn't frame it as a question or hedge it with "I think" or "it seemed like." She put the statistic on the table and stated plainly that what had been happening to her team over the last several games was, in her words, pretty egregious. She talked about how the Indiana Fever had been hitting the rim, competing hard, doing the work, while facing a level of disrespect that she described as fairly incredible. Not incredible in the impressive sense, incredible in the sense that she could barely believe it was actually happening in a professional basketball league. And then she went somewhere that almost no coach in professional sports is willing to go. She called out the league's internal grievance process directly. Not in vague terms, not with the kind of careful, diplomatic language that keeps coaches out of trouble with the front office. She said clearly and on record that there is a system in place for teams to submit complaints and communicate their concerns to the league, and that in her experience, she has never once felt like that system actually works. She questioned its effectiveness. She implied that the league either doesn't care about the complaints when they come in or actively ignores them when they're inconvenient. For a professional league coach, that's an extraordinary thing to say publicly. Most coaches in that position accept the fine that comes with criticizing officiating, make their point in vague enough terms that it doesn't become a direct indictment of league leadership, and move on. White didn't do that. She was explicit. She was direct. And when the obvious follow-up question about facing potential sanctions for her comments came up, her response was essentially 2 words: screw the repercussions. She wasn't there to protect herself. She was there to protect her player and her team, and she had clearly reached the point where the risk of saying nothing outweighed the risk of saying everything. Now, what's important to understand here is that White's frustration didn't come out of nowhere that evening. It had been accumulating for weeks. Every game where her star player absorbed physical punishment that went uncalled. Every time she watched opponents grab and shove Caitlin Clark and saw the officials decide that none of it was worth a whistle. Every loss that might have been a win with consistent officiating. It had been building and building, and that post-game conference was the moment it finally overflowed. But what is significant as White's press conference was, it wasn't the thing that finally forced the WNBA to act. The thing that forced the WNBA to act was far more concrete and far more expensive. On June 16, 2026, the Indiana Fever made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the sports world. Caitlin Clark had suffered a left quad strain and would be sidelined for at minimum 2 weeks. The team was careful to note that this was a new injury, not something related to any previous physical issues she'd been dealing with. This was fresh damage. And the timing of it, given everything that had been happening on the court, made it almost impossible to look at as a coincidence. Here's why that injury hit differently than a typical star player missing time with a typical injury. Caitlin Clark had not missed a single game since 2017. Read that again. Since 2017, nearly a decade, she had suited up, competed, and played through whatever came her way without missing a single contest.
That kind of durability is rare in any sport at any level. It speaks to conditioning, commitment, and an athlete's sheer refusal to let anything take them off the floor. 8 years, not a single game missed. And the streak ended not because of a freak accident, not because of some unavoidable collision in the flow of normal basketball, but after months of documented physical targeting that the officials had repeatedly chosen not to address. The evidence that Clark had been playing through this injury for weeks before the announcement is genuinely unsettling. There's video footage, not fan speculation, actual footage of her applying heat packs to her leg during games prior to the official injury announcement. She was managing it, trying to stay on the floor, continuing to compete while her body was clearly telling her something was wrong. And the reason she had to manage it instead of resting it is that the physical punishment she was absorbing every single game was making it impossible for the injury to heal. Look at the game footage from the weeks leading up to the announcement, and what you see is not basketball. What you see is a calculated campaign of physical intimidation directed at one player. Grabbing, shoving, applying pressure in ways that aren't designed to contest shots or force turnovers. They're designed to make the person on the receiving end uncomfortable, off balance, and eventually beaten down. This is the kind of treatment that, applied to virtually any other player in any other league, would have been whistled dead in the first quarter and shut down completely by halftime once the officials made clear they weren't going to allow it. Instead, it continued night after night because the officials had established, through inaction, that it was acceptable. Eventually, a body that has been grabbed, shoved, and physically worn down repeatedly without any protective intervention from the people paid to enforce the rules of the game will give out. That's not surprising. That's physics. That's human biology. A grade 1 quad strain in an athlete who has been absorbing that level of physical punishment over months is not bad luck. It's a foreseeable consequence of a foreseeable pattern that the people with the authority to stop it decided not to stop. And here's the brutal irony. The people who made that decision, the officials who swallowed their whistles night after night, didn't just fail Caitlin Clark as an athlete, they failed the very league they were supposedly serving. Because the moment that injury was announced, the financial consequences became immediate, dramatic, and undeniable. If you want to understand why 3 referees got suspended within days of the injury announcement, forget the moral argument for a second. Forget the sportsmanship argument. Forget the basic basketball integrity argument. Just look at the money. Because the money tells the whole story in a way that no amount of press releases or carefully worded statements can obscure. The viewership gap around Caitlin Clark in the WNBA is not a talking point. It's not something her fan base invented to make her seem more important than she is. It's a documented statistical reality that shows up every time you look at the broadcast numbers. In 2026, WNBA games featuring Caitlin Clark averaged 1.19 million viewers. Games without her averaged 394,000. Those aren't numbers from different eras or different contexts. Those are the same league, the same season, measured on the same networks. The difference between 1.19 million and 394,000 isn't just a ratings gap. That's the difference between a league that matters to a mainstream audience and a league that disappears back into the sports media margins where it spent most of the last 2 decades. The broader economic impact of her presence in Indianapolis specifically is the kind of thing that makes league executives wake up in cold sweats when they contemplate what her absence means. After Clark was drafted by the Indiana Fever, the tourism website Visit Indy recorded a 501% increase to their Indiana Fever specific page. 501%. Hotel reservations in Indianapolis showed a clear, measurable correlation with Indiana Fever home game dates. The attention she generated led directly to the construction of a $75 million practice facility, a level of infrastructure investment that doesn't happen for teams operating on the financial margins the WNBA had been living on before she arrived. This isn't one player making a team better on the court. This is one player fundamentally reshaping the economic reality of a franchise and, by extension, the league it belongs to. And the betting markets, which have a way of cutting through the noise and getting straight to what something is actually worth, reacted to her injury news with brutal honesty. Her MVP odds on FanDuel moved from even money to plus 210. On DraftKings, they shifted to plus 150. That's not a minor adjustment based on her missing 2 weeks. That's the market saying, plainly and without sentiment, that her absence creates a meaningful uncertainty about the entire trajectory of her season, and by extension, about what the league looks like without her driving it. The most vivid illustration of what her absence costs came from the ticket market for the much-anticipated rematch between the Indiana Fever and the Valkyries. That game, Clark versus Kia Stokes, a matchup that had built genuine mainstream buzz, was seeing average ticket prices of $137. The night after the injury announcement, those average prices dropped to $80, a 42% collapse in ticket value overnight. Not because the game changed, not because anything else about the matchup was different, because the person people were buying tickets to see was suddenly not going to be there. Stephen A. Smith, who has built a career on saying what everyone else is thinking before everyone else is willing to say it, put it directly: if the ratings show a sharp decline once Clark is out of the picture, then everyone in that league needs to sit down and acknowledge that all the talk about her being the golden goose was completely accurate. He's not wrong. The numbers aren't ambiguous. This isn't a projection or a theory about what Clark means to the WNBA. It's already happened. The evidence is already in the viewership data, the ticket markets, the tourism statistics, and the investment decisions that followed her arrival. The question was never whether she was the driving financial force behind the league's recent growth. The question was why the people who benefit from that growth allowed her to be systematically targeted until her body broke down. And the answer to that question requires going behind the curtain to understand how the WNBA's officiating is actually controlled, because what former officials have revealed about that system is more alarming than most fans realize. Here's where the story stops being just about bad officiating and starts being about something considerably more uncomfortable. Because what reporting on the WNBA's internal structure has revealed in recent months suggests that the physical style of play Clark was subjected to wasn't necessarily the result of individual referees making bad calls. It may have been the result of referees following instructions from people who never set foot on the court. An investigation by SB Nation laid out the structure clearly. The WNBA operates with a competition committee, a body made up of governors, general managers, coaches, and, crucially, stakeholders that effectively determines what kind of basketball the league is going to permit. This committee sets the standards for physicality. It decides what level of contact is acceptable, what degree of aggression officials should allow, and what kind of game the WNBA is going to be. And according to the reporting, stakeholders in that committee prioritize something specific above player safety and above competitive integrity. They prioritize narratives and financial outcomes. Former NBA referee Mick McCutcheon made this explicit in a way that's hard to walk back. McCutcheon, who famously went from substitute teacher to NBA official by writing a letter directly to the league and working his way up through sheer determination, explained the dynamic with uncomfortable clarity. Referees in the WNBA, he said, don't make independent decisions about play style or rule interpretation. They receive instructions from the competition committee. They referee according to those instructions. And the feedback officials get, the evaluations, the performance reviews, the guidance on whether they're meeting expectations, comes from the stakeholders on that committee, not from players, not from coaches, not from the fans watching the product at home, from stakeholders who have financial interests in how the game is played and what narratives the game generates. Read that back slowly and let it sink in. If McCutcheon's account is accurate, and he has no obvious reason to fabricate it, then when Caitlin Clark was being grabbed, shoved, and physically targeted night after night, with officials refusing to intervene, those officials weren't necessarily being incompetent. They may have been doing exactly what the people above them told them to do. The physicality wasn't a bug in the officiating system. It may have been a feature, a sanctioned approach to how the game should be played, determined by a committee that answers to financial interests rather than to the athletes competing on the floor.
The competitions committee's response to the wave of new viewers who arrived specifically because of Caitlin Clark makes this dynamic even clearer. When fan criticism of the officiating intensified and new viewers began publicly questioning what they were seeing on the court, the committee's position, according to reporting on their internal communications, was essentially dismissive. The argument was that the flood of new fans simply hadn't watched the WNBA long enough to understand the game's physical style, that they were applying standards from other sports or other contexts and misidentifying normal WNBA basketball as something problematic. In other words, the committee's position was that the fans complaining about what they were watching were wrong, that the officiating was fine, that the physicality directed at Clark was within the bounds of the game as they had defined it, and they maintained that position right up until the injury and the financial consequences made maintaining it impossible. This brings us to the referees themselves, and a structural problem in how the WNBA recruits and develops officials that goes well beyond anything that happened in the Fever Valkyries game. Most fans who are angry about WNBA officiating focus on the individual calls or the individual non-calls. They see a missed foul and they're frustrated with the referee who didn't blow the whistle. That's a natural reaction. That's how sports frustration works. But the deeper issue isn't any one referee making a bad decision in a crucial moment. The deeper issue is how the WNBA ends up with referees making those decisions in the first place. And the answer reveals a structural problem that has been building for years. WNBA referees, like their NBA counterparts, begin their path to professional basketball in the G League. That part makes sense. The G League exists specifically as a developmental environment for players, coaches, and officials. What makes less sense is where the scouting process goes to find G League referee candidates. According to reporting on the league's officiating pipeline, scouts aren't primarily looking at major college programs or even high-level amateur competitions. They're looking at college gyms, high school gyms, local circuits where basketball is being played at levels that bear almost no resemblance to what happens at the professional level. The pathway that exists in the WNBA officiating structure is essentially this: referee high school games well enough to get noticed, get placed in the G League, develop in that environment, and end up officiating professional women's basketball. The gap between the highest level of competition you might have officiated before the G League and the level of competition you're suddenly responsible for managing in a professional league is enormous. The speed is different, the physicality is different, the pressure is different, the stakes are different, and the skills required to manage a professional game with elite athletes competing for their livelihoods are fundamentally different from the skills required to manage a high school game in a gym with a few hundred people watching. One of the 3 suspended referees illustrates this pipeline problem in the most direct possible way. Before being promoted to professional basketball, this official's experience was concentrated almost entirely at the high school level. The passion for the game was there. The commitment was evident. There are reports of this referee writing directly to the league and advocating to be given an opportunity, which echoes McCutcheon's own career path in some ways. But passion and commitment, while necessary, are not the same as the experience and judgment needed to referee at the highest level of professional competition. This wasn't someone who had spent years developing at the college level, building up to the G League and earning a professional spot through a long apprenticeship in high-pressure environments. This was someone who went from high school gyms to professional basketball with a development pathway that, in retrospect, wasn't adequate preparation for what the job actually requires. Now, to be fair to the individual referees involved, they were working within a system that told them what standards to apply and what level of physicality to permit. They were following instructions from above, according to everything McCutcheon and other sources have explained about how the officiating structure actually works. But that doesn't mean the structural problem of recruiting officials without sufficient high-level experience isn't real, because it absolutely is. And it's going to continue producing officials who aren't fully equipped for what the professional game demands unless the league addresses it deliberately and systematically. Which raises the obvious question, did the WNBA know about these structural issues before everything blew up? And if so, why did it take a star player's injury and a 42% ticket price collapse to finally motivate some kind of response?
On a Tuesday morning, buried in a standard press release with the kind of bland corporate language designed to minimize attention rather than generate it, the WNBA announced that 3 referees had been suspended pending further review. No press conference, no public statement from the commissioner, no direct acknowledgement of Caitlin Clark or the Indiana Fever, no apology, no explanation of what specific failures had triggered the action, just a brief, carefully worded notice that 3 officials had been relieved of their duties while the league conducted its review, and a clear organizational preference for this news to land quietly and disappear quickly. That press release strategy tells you almost everything you need to know about how the WNBA views these suspensions. If the league genuinely believed this was a moment of accountability, a turning point where they were acknowledging a serious failure and committing to doing better, they would have handled it differently. They would have had the commissioner speak publicly. They would have addressed the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark directly. They would have shown the kind of transparency that genuine accountability requires. The fact that they went with a Tuesday morning press release designed to generate minimum coverage is the clearest possible signal that these suspensions were not primarily about justice. They were about damage control. And here's the thing. The WNBA had the evidence it needed to act weeks before it did. According to sources familiar with the situation, the league had access to the footage for weeks. Fan-recorded video from multiple angles, the heat compression footage showing Clark managing a leg injury through games where she was being physically targeted, broadcast replay angles showing the contact clearly, game footage from multiple contests painting a consistent picture of a pattern, not isolated incidents, but a repeated, documentable pattern of physicality directed at one player that officials were not addressing. All of that was available. None of it generated a suspension or a public statement or even an informal warning that things needed to change. Until the injury. Until the ticket prices dropped 42% in a single night. Until the viewership projections for the upcoming schedule suddenly looked terrifying without the player those projections were built around. That's when the league decided the situation required action. Not when the footage was available, not when the pattern was undeniable, when the money started moving in the wrong direction. The 3 suspended referees, whatever their individual failures, are in a genuinely difficult position because they were working within a system that told them how to officiate. They received feedback and evaluations from stakeholders on the competition committee. They applied the standards they were given. The idea that the solution to a systemic officiating problem driven by committee instructions and stakeholder priorities is to suspend 3 individual referees and call it accountability is the kind of thinking that confuses the symptom with the disease. The referees were the visible face of a problem. The problem itself runs considerably deeper. Translation, and nobody in the league's press office is going to phrase it this way, but this is what happened. The WNBA watched its most valuable asset get physically targeted for months, had the evidence in hand, did nothing, watched that asset get injured, watched the financial consequences hit immediately and dramatically, and then rushed to perform accountability in the least conspicuous way possible in hopes that the story would fade before the full extent of their negligence became the headline. It won't fade, because Caitlin Clark is going to come back. And when she does, the entire sports world is going to be watching very, very closely.
Step back for a moment from the specifics of the calls and the statistics and the press releases and consider the broader picture of what the WNBA has actually done here. Because the irony at the center of this entire story is so stark that it would be almost funny if it weren't so genuinely damaging. For years, not months, but years, the WNBA struggled to find mainstream relevance. The league produced extraordinary athletes, competing at a genuinely high level, but the viewership numbers were modest, the media coverage was sparse, and the cultural conversation around women's professional basketball was limited to a relatively small and dedicated fan base. The league wanted more. It needed more. It applied pressure to broadcast partners. It lobbied for better time slots. It made the case publicly and privately that women's basketball deserved the kind of attention that the product on the court justified. And then Caitlin Clark showed up. The effect was immediate and measurable in ways that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. ESPN made the decision to broadcast a WNBA preseason game for the first time in the network's history, specifically because Clark was playing in it. Think about what that means. Not a playoff game, not a championship, a preseason game. The audience that showed up to watch Clark play Iowa against Brazil in that preseason broadcast produced viewership numbers that, according to the data, only 2 NBA games on ESPN since 2010 had matched, and both of those games featured LeBron James. That's not a small comp. That's being mentioned in the same breath as the most commercially valuable athlete in basketball over the last 15 years.
The regular season numbers were even more dramatic. 41 of the Indiana Fever's 44 regular season games were scheduled for national broadcast that year. Not because the Fever were a perennial powerhouse, not because Indianapolis had suddenly become the center of the basketball universe, because Caitlin Clark was on the roster, and every network that had broadcast rights understood that her presence meant viewers were going to show up. That is the Caitlin Clark effect in its purest form, a player so significant to the league's commercial viability that she essentially rewrote the broadcast calculus for an entire franchise's season. And knowing all of that, having watched it happen in real time, having seen the viewership numbers come in week after week, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that this player was doing something for their league that nobody had done in decades, the people running the WNBA allowed her to be physically targeted game after game until she got hurt. They had the footage, they had the statistics, they had the -31 free throw disparity. They had coaches publicly calling out the officiating in press conferences. They had fan reaction, making it clear that what was happening on the court was visible to everyone watching. They had all of it, and they did nothing, until the financial consequences of their inaction became too severe to ignore. That's not mismanagement. That's not just negligence. That's an organization undermining its own most valuable asset in real time with full knowledge of what that asset means to their survival, because the internal forces shaping how the game is officiated prioritized something else over the obvious imperative of protecting their biggest star. The broadcast relationship with ESPN, the one that was literally built on the foundation of Caitlin Clark's appeal, represents the kind of opportunity that leagues spend decades trying to cultivate. The WNBA had that opportunity handed to them by one player's extraordinary ability to draw mainstream attention, and they spent months allowing that player to be treated in ways that eventually put her on the injury report. Stephen A. Smith has been watching all of this with the kind of focused attention that comes from decades of covering sports and understanding what the numbers actually mean. His warning is simple and direct. If the ratings show a significant decline with Clark out of the picture, everyone associated with this league needs to sit down and acknowledge what they've been told repeatedly, that she is the engine driving everything. He's right. And more than that, the decline, when it shows up in the numbers, won't be a warning. It'll be confirmation of something that was already obviously true. Here's where we are right now.
Caitlin Clark is sidelined. The Indiana Fever's upcoming schedule, which was supposed to include the highly anticipated rematch with the Valkyries, Clark versus Stokes, a matchup that had been drawing massive mainstream attention, is now a different product. Instead of the matchup that was generating enormous buzz, viewers are going to see a game built around role players trying to fill an absence that can't really be filled. Angel Reese, whatever her talents, is not Caitlin Clark, and watching her try to build her brand against role players, as one commentator put it, is not the same product that was drawing 1.19 million viewers per game and breaking WNBA viewership records. The league is about to get a very clear, very real-time demonstration of exactly what Caitlin Clark means to their bottom line. The upcoming games without her aren't just going to be losses on the court for the Indiana Fever. They're going to be a public referendum on whether the WNBA has a viable mainstream product without its most appealing player. The viewership numbers, the ticket prices, the betting market activity, all of it is going to tell a story in the coming weeks that the competition committee and the stakeholders on it are not going to enjoy reading. And then, eventually, Caitlin Clark comes back, and that's when we find out whether any of this actually meant anything. Because the suspensions are relatively easy. Suspending 3 individual referees costs the league very little in practical terms. It generates some positive press, it gives the impression of accountability, and it allows the organization to move forward with a narrative of, "We identified the problem and we addressed it." If the competition committee's instructions about permitted physicality don't change, if the standards applied to how Clark is officiated don't change, if she comes back and the same patterns of uncalled contact resume, minus 3 visible scapegoats who took the fall for a systemic failure, then the suspensions were exactly what they looked like in that Tuesday morning press release, a performance designed to manage a crisis, not a genuine reckoning with what caused it. The only meaningful accountability here is behavioral change that shows up in how the game is played and officiated after Clark returns. If she's protected the way a player of her commercial and competitive significance deserves to be protected, then maybe the lesson was learned. If the pattern resumes and the officials continue to swallow their whistles while opponents target her physically, then we'll know definitively that the suspensions were about protecting revenue, not about protecting Caitlin Clark. The WNBA has been given an extraordinary opportunity. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring viewers to their league, she brought the kind of sustained, culturally significant attention that money genuinely cannot buy. The storylines she generates, the rivalries she's at the center of, the mainstream sports conversation she's been able to drive, all of that was available to a league that had spent years trying and failing to manufacture exactly that kind of cultural relevance. It showed up on its own, attached to one player, and the league's job was simply to not screw it up. They screwed it up. The question now is whether they understand that clearly enough to actually fix it. 3 referees were suspended. The announcement was buried in a press release on a Tuesday morning, stripped of any direct acknowledgement of the player whose targeting made those suspensions necessary. No apology, no press conference, no commissioner standing in front of cameras and explaining to the Indiana Fever, to Caitlin Clark, and to the 1.19 million people who were tuning in specifically because of her, what went wrong and what the league intends to do differently. Just a brief statement, a few names, and a quiet hope that the story would go away before anyone looked too closely at the timeline, at the weeks of footage the league had before acting, at the financial triggers that actually produced the action, at the committee structure that may have been setting officiating standards that made this entire situation possible. The referees who were suspended were working in a system that told them how to do their jobs. The system itself, the competition committee, the stakeholder priorities, the feedback mechanisms that exclude players and coaches in favor of people with financial interests, that system has not been addressed. 3 individuals took the fall for a structural failure, and until the structure changes, the conditions that produced this outcome remain in place. When Caitlin Clark comes back, and she will come back, probably sooner than later given her durability and competitive drive, the entire sports world is going to be watching. Not just to see her play, to see whether the officiating looks different, to see whether the physical targeting resumes, or whether the lesson was actually learned, to see whether the WNBA is capable of protecting its most important asset, or whether they'll find a new way to undermine the best thing that's happened to them in decades. The answer to that question is the only meaningful measure of whether any of this mattered. A Tuesday morning press release is not accountability. A tweet announcing 3 suspensions is not accountability. Accountability is Caitlin Clark returning to that court, getting fouled clearly, and watching a referee blow the whistle without hesitation, because the people above them finally made clear that protecting the league's brightest star was no longer optional. We'll see if the WNBA is actually capable of that. Based on everything we've watched over the last several months, the jury is still very much out. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think these suspensions were genuine accountability, or was this purely about the money? And if Caitlin Clark comes back and the same patterns resume, what does that tell you about whether the league actually learned anything? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is far from over.